Hi everyone. If you're just joining us today, I will be giving a short Dharma sharing. Just setting myself up here on the computer before I continue. While I'm doing that, why not everyone tell me how you're doing? How's your week been? I know that it's been an interesting one with a lot of changes for many people. Just going to wait for a few more people to join us before we properly begin. So this week I will be talking about the subject of guilt. It is a bit of a long subject, so if I'm not able to complete it all today, then I will break it up into next week as well. All right, good morning everyone who is just joining us. Oh gosh. As usual, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the comment section and I will do my best to reply to them for you. Good morning, Sukfan. Hope that you had a good meditation session with JP this morning if you joined him. But yeah, so if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask them, preferably at the end of the session so that all the questions are bundled together and it's easier for me to find them. I don't know what it is with Facebook, but sometimes, all the questions don't always appear. Good morning, Rina. Hi, Iman. Hi, Jerry. If you're just joining us, I will be talking about guilt today. All right, and as I mentioned, it's a bit long, so I may end up taking a little too much time this week. We'll see. Morning, Leon. Okay, so as usual, before we start every sharing, we should set a motivation both from the side of the listener as well as the speaker. So do a short prayer. I go for refuge in my Lama, from whom I receive these teachings. I go for refuge in the lineage gurus, from whom my Lama has received these teachings. Okay, so do I need to introduce myself? I don't know. My name is Pastor Jinai, as most of you who are joining us on the feed already know. But my name is Pastor Jinai, and morning Sharon, and I'm a pastor based here in Kechara in Malaysia. And yeah, it's been an interesting week, hasn't it? And today, our Prime Minister at 3 p.m. is giving an address about whether the movement control order is going to continue. So let's see what he says. A lot of hope for further relaxation of the rules. Anyway, so last week I spoke about humility. And this week, the reason why I wanted to talk about guilt is because very often people conflate or they confuse guilt they confuse the cultivation of humility with guilt and with self-flagellation. So if you don't know what self-flagellation is, I'm not going to get into it here, but Google it and you'll see what I mean. All right. So very often people confuse and conflate the cultivation, the practice of humility with self-flagellation and guilt. And it's this commonly held misunderstanding that we have, that is that by being guilty, we are practicing humility. Because by being guilty in some way, we're not holding ourselves in high regard. And I'm going to explain about why that's not actually the case. So being humble isn't actually about being guilty. Being humble, as I explained last week, is about the absence of pride and it's about the absence of arrogance. And being humble is about putting down our ego, and it's about offering the victory to others, and it's about giving up our need, or the need for the wish to be right, or the wish to win all the time. All right, so guilt in itself is an entirely different quality. And I read something very interesting earlier this week, which I want to share with you guys about guilt. And it's that guilt comes from a position of superiority. It leaves the burden of comforting us on the other person instead of addressing the problem that the other person is facing. So it changes the focus of the situation from the other person's problem and how we can remedy and help to resolve the other person's problem over to ourselves. We turn the focus on into ourselves when we feel guilty. On the other hand, humility is very different, right? So humility is putting down our ego, putting down our self-grasping mind, and learning to focus on the other person and how we can help the other person, how we can alleviate the suffering of the other person. All right, so last week I also talked about how society trains us to be very boastful in our accomplishments and to be very prideful and to use the language of pride in our accomplishments. And on the opposite end of the scale, society also trains us to sometimes be ashamed of our accomplishments and to sometimes to feel guilty about doing well, especially when we may have started out at the same place as somebody else, and over time somehow we're doing better. Society trains us to feel guilty about doing better than other people. So already you can see that there are a lot of mixed messages that society is telling us, right? And why is it that society tells us these mixed messages? It's because people, usually out of good intention, they will share with you what they know, right? But as we know, for sentient beings who are in this cycle of existence, cyclic existence in samsara, our advice and our suggestions and the help that we offer people, whether we like it or not, is going to be colored by selfishness. It's going to be stained by selfishness. And whatever help and advice we offer, again, despite our good intentions, we're doing it based on our reality. We're doing it based on our experiences and what it is that we've concluded about what we perceive around us. So it's always going to be biased towards what we found has worked for us. But the thing is, not everyone's the same. So that's why when you go around asking, different people for different opinions, of course you're going to get different answers, right? You're going to get different answers when you ask questions to different people, because everyone had different experiences, and that's why society ends up giving us a mixed message. So on the one hand, be happy and be proud of what you've accomplished. On the other hand, be guilty and feel bad about doing better than somebody else. So in explaining this, already you can see that there are many benefits to practicing Buddha's teachings, especially that on walking the middle path, walking the line between self-indulgence and self-gratification versus self-mortification, right? Because what the Buddha taught, the Dharma teachings that the Buddha gave, they transcend all of these stains of selfishness and self-grasping mind that we have in us. They are universal truths. The Buddha described universal truths. So already from that we can see that if we practice the Buddha's teachings, we can overcome or transcend the mixed messages that society gives us. So anyway, having said all that, let's get into guilt. There are two types of guilt. There is the guilt which is an admission of wrongdoing, an admission of guilt. So when, for example, when you're in court and you say, I'm guilty of doing that, right? So acknowledging that you've done something wrong. Then there is a second type of guilt, which you guys may be familiar with, which is seeing and projecting our mistakes whilst not knowing what to do about them or choosing not to do something about it. So that distinction is actually very important, the distinction of choosing not to do something about it, because it's basically us saying that we refuse to correct our mistakes. We are making we are aware of what we've done. We are aware of our wrongdoing. We acknowledge that we've done wrong, but we are making an active choice not to do something about it. And that active choice is based on this non-acceptance of ourselves and this non-acceptance of our situation. I don't fully accept my complicity in something, therefore I'm not going to do something about it. So what happens when you are guilty? Oh, good morning, Pastor Shin. In case you guys don't know, Pastor Shin has been working extremely hard and hasn't actually slept today, all right? And then later today, if I'm not mistaken, at 2 p.m. on the Chinese Kechara Facebook page, she will be doing prayers. So really, really hardworking, all right? And she's here joining us on this sharing. So hi, Pastor Shin. So what is the result of guilt? When you are guilty, or when you feel guilty, or when you focus and cultivate guilt, what happens is that it becomes paralyzing, because the thought enters into our mind that there's no point trying to do something or to fix something because you've already messed up. And it's not too far a stretch to see how that kind of thought process could lead to laziness, because you feel guilty, and because you feel guilty, then you think you're torturing yourself. And then because you're torturing yourself and you're already making yourself feel bad, you think, oh, because I feel so bad, I'm already doing enough and I have sufficiently atoned for my sins, so I don't need to do anymore. So as a result of feeling guilty because you're paralyzed and you choose not to do something about it, there is no change in your situation. You don't actually address the root causes of why you feel guilty in the first place, or what creates the guilt in the first place. And because you don't do that, you don't do anything to remedy the situation. And since you don't apply a remedy, then there's no change and there's no improvement. So that lack of change or that lack of improvement can, over time, it can lead us to feeling depressed. It can lead us to being frustrated, and it's natural because you think, I've tried so hard, or you think you've tried so hard. I feel so bad about the situation. Why is it that nothing's changed? Why is it that nothing's different, right? So guilt clouds our judgment. Guilt leads us to see things not as they are, actually, because guilt makes us feel like we've done something about the mistake that's in front of us, or the harm that we've caused to somebody else, when actually we haven't done anything at all. We've just felt bad. And then when other people hear that we're feeling bad, most people, they won't know, right? They won't know what causes guilt. So most people will, out of good intention again, will come and try and comfort you. So again, you're placing the burden, the emotional burden of comforting you on somebody else, and turning the focus away on fixing the problem, as opposed to, and turning it on to soothing you, right? So because it's so easy to feel guilty, and because we are habituated into feeling guilty, guilt is addictive. It is addictive because it's so easy. It's so easy to feel guilty, to feel like you're doing something about the situation. And because it's so addictive, because it's something that we enjoy doing so much, invariably what ends up happening is that we find different coping mechanisms to deal with our guilt. These coping mechanisms, because it's arising from guilt, these coping mechanisms generally do not tend to be focused on remedy. They don't tend to be focused on rectifying the problem. They tend to be focused on hiding and suppressing the guilt. So what then ends up happening in a lot of cases is that people end up looking for outlets for their frustration and for their depression, looking for ways to hide the reasons why they feel guilty, and then looking for ways to hide that guilt itself. So, for example, people might commonly turn to, for example, violence, or they might even turn to substance abuse, for example, alcohol or drug dependency. And I'm not going to get into it again here because it's not the appropriate talk, but if you think about it, you meditate on it, and you analyze the situation, alcohol and alcohol abuse, substance abuse is a form of violence. It's not violence to other people necessarily, but it is violence to yourself, right? So you end up, good morning, Jerry. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining. Yeah, when we become addicted to guilt, then we try to find different coping mechanisms to hide the guilt, or to suppress the guilt, or to hide the reasons why we're feeling guilty. And then when we do that, and we look for reasons and look for ways to cope with the guilt, subconsciously we know we're doing something wrong, because we know subconsciously that we haven't done anything to actually fix the problem. So then we feel guilty about not actually addressing the problem. We feel guilty for not rectifying the situation, and we feel guilty for resorting to coping mechanisms as opposed to actually rectifying or resolving the issue. And then we feel guilty about that, and then we end up getting trapped in this kind of vicious cycle. You do something wrong, you feel guilty about it, but because you don't do anything to resolve what you've done wrong, you feel guilty about that. So then you try to find ways to cover that guilt, or to cover your lack of action, and then you feel guilty about that. And so it goes on and on and on and on, and then you end up being in this cycle of addictive guilt, right? And that in itself creates an entirely new set of problems for us, being stuck in this vicious cycle. And that's exactly why Buddha talked about cyclic existence, because we do trap ourselves in this cycle, right? And as a result of this reinforcement again and again of feeling guilty, and then feeling guilty about being guilty, we also reinforce this lack of self-confidence in ourselves, and we start to reinforce a sense of self-hatred in us. So that's often why you see people who are very, very guilty or who feel very, very guilty also have a low sense of self-worth, because they keep reinforcing in themselves that I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm not deserving, over and over again. And then because we are addicted to this guilt and addicted to being self-deprecating, I'm not good enough, these feelings of inadequacy arise, and then they become very, very strongly imprinted into our minds. Oh, hold on. Sorry, give me 1 minute. Having slight technical issues. Okay, so it seems like the internet on my computer is down. I don't know if that means that you guys can still hear me on Facebook. Just checking on my phone. Okay, it's still working. So I'm just going to wait till the internet on my computer resolves itself, and then I will go through. Hopefully, it will be done by the end of this talk, and then I'll be able to go through your questions. All right. So, let me see. If there are any technical issues on this side, please do let me know, guys. All right. So where was I? Okay. So yes, this is precisely why I have notes, right? Because when this happens, I can immediately jump back onto the point. So what happens is when you reinforce guilt, or when you focus on guilt, it's paralyzing, because you think that you've done enough to atone for your sins when actually you haven't done very much at all. And then as a result of that, depression and frustration arise. And in order to cope with the guilt, or to cope with the lack of doing something about the guilt, or in order to cope with the depression or the frustration, then we lash out onto other people. We look for coping mechanisms. Excuse me. We look for coping mechanisms to deal with this guilt, and these coping mechanisms are usually focused on hiding or suppressing the guilt. And because we feel guilty about not doing anything about that, and we feel guilty about resorting to coping mechanisms, then we get trapped in this vicious cycle. And then we start to reinforce these ideas of self-hatred and this lack of self-confidence in us, and we end up reinforcing feelings of inadequacy. I'm not worthy, I'm not deserving, I'm not good enough. All right. And then because of this, because we haven't actually addressed the situation, then we end up lashing out at other people. And where does all of this come from? It's the environment around us. It's society around us, right? So society is very competitive, and society tells us that the best way to feel guilty is to engage or to express self-judgment. So I didn't wake up early enough. I didn't do enough work today. I fell off my diet. I didn't follow my diet. I don't do enough exercise. I don't watch what I eat enough. Look at my friend who started out at the same time as me and is now doing better than me. So society reinforces this sense of competitiveness, and then tells us that if you're not competitive enough and that if you don't match up enough, you've got something to feel guilty about. And because of this perfect storm of variables, perfect storm of factors, perfect storm of characteristics, what have you, we end up reinforcing this negative view that we have of the world, and we also reinforce our false sense of I am bad, I am evil, I am unworthy, I'm undeserving, I'm not good enough, as though the I in and of itself is inherently bad. The funny thing about society telling us that we should compete is that society also tells us that as sentient beings, we're not perfect. Okay, and society also tells us that as sentient beings, because you're not perfect, you've got something to feel guilty about. And that if you try hard enough, and that if you work hard enough, you will be able to overcome all of your mistakes, you'll be able to overcome all of your shortcomings, and you'll be able to become perfect and better beings. So society tells us that you're not good enough, but society also tells us that you should be better, and that if you're not better, you have something to feel guilty about because there's something that's wrong and not good enough about you. And then when you don't fulfill this expectation, and when you don't fulfill this projected expectation, and the pressure gets too much, what happens is you get frustrated, and then you get angry at yourself, and then you fixate on your mistakes or what you perceive to be your mistakes, and then you fixate on all the things that you could have done wrong, or all the things you did wrong, and all the things you could have done right, and then you develop this tunnel vision. You fixate, and that's all you look at. What did I do wrong? What could I have done better? And that's all you think about. I feel you reinforce this guilt in yourself. So guilt makes you develop tunnel vision, and it prevents you from seeing beyond and seeing into the periphery and looking at the situation clearly and analyzing it and seeing what you can do or what you could have done to really make it better, and then to actually apply those steps. So what Rinpoche told us is that the I is not inherently bad. Why? Because the I is our Buddha nature. All of us have the potential to become Buddhas. And so if all of us have the potential to become Buddhas, how can that Buddha potential be bad? It's not possible for the Buddha potential to be bad. What is happening is that we have all this muck in our minds, right? We have all this mud in our minds, and all this mud is covering that Buddha potential. All this guilt, the jealousy, the anger, the hatred, all of these afflictive emotions, all this mud is covering our Buddha potential. So we are acting out of all these characteristics, all these qualities, which are not essentially us. What we are at our essence is the potential to become Buddhas, is the potential to become enlightened, and that potential cannot be bad. So when we focus and when we reinforce and we develop guilt, what we're doing is we're actually piling on more mud on top of this positive, virtuous nature that we all possess inside of us. And so with guilt, we keep reinforcing all of these actions, and we let these actions and these thoughts define us when that's not who we really are. So guilt, it reinforces this false sense of I. It reinforces this sense of I that we are bad when actually we are not. And the Buddha taught that we are not. And finally, what does guilt do? And, like I said at the beginning of this talk, we've got comments. Internet is still not working. Sharon, I can still hear you loud and clear. Very loud, sorry. Pastor Shin, I don't know if you're hearing me through this or the fact that you're sitting behind me on the other end of the room. But anyway, okay. Earlier I mentioned about guilt, right? And I talked about how guilt is often confused with the cultivation of humility. But it's not actually the case, because humility is the absence of pride and is the absence of arrogance, whereas guilt is very, very self-serving, right? And that is the other thing about guilt, which is that guilt is a very sneaky, it's a very, very tricky form of self-centeredness, it's a very tricky form of self-indulgence, and it's primarily driven by self-hatred. Rinpoche really, really loved to use the words pity party to describe guilt, because most of the time, we like to be very expressive about our guilt. We like to be very expressive in our facial actions, in our facial expressions, in our body language, and in our words. Oh, I'm so sorry about that. I'm so sorry about that. I'm so sorry about that. Right? But then it stops there. And when we say that, and when we do that, and we put on that demeanor of guilt, what we're actually asking people to do is to comfort us and to say, hey, oh, look at this person, they're so good because they feel guilty about something, and so, oh, we should go and comfort that person. So when we feel guilty, actually, what Rinpoche said is we're throwing ourselves a pity party, and that is actually arising out of selfishness and self-centeredness, taking and detracting the attention away from the problem itself and then focusing on us and comforting us. It arises from a position of thinking that we are superior to other people. We deserve to be comforted. It's not, like I wrote down here, what I wrote here was that, when we feel guilty, we do or we say something that we feel guilty about, and then we get lost in the stories about how things could have been different, about what we should have said, what we shouldn't have said, what we could have done, what we shouldn't have done. And we make it all about us. Guilt doesn't direct us or doesn't compel us to focus on our personal complicity in something, and it doesn't focus on the other person's pain or the suffering that we might have caused somebody else, and it doesn't focus on how we can change it and how we can make things better. So we get stuck in this vicious cycle of self-judgment and self-flagellation and self-blame, and then we get stuck in this cycle of feeling even more guilty. Why am I guilty? Why didn't I feel guilty last time? Why am I feeling guilty now? Do I feel more guilty now than I did last time? What is different now? What can I do in the future so that I don't feel guilty again? So it becomes very, very self-centered. All right. So now that I've talked about, all the reasons why we shouldn't feel guilty or the results of feeling guilty, then, okay, Iman, I see your question. I will answer it at the end, all right? So instead of feeling guilty, you might be thinking, all right, so when something bad happens or when I'm involved in or responsible for something negative, what is it can I do? All right, does it mean that I should never feel guilty? And does it mean that if I've done something wrong, I should never feel bad about it? Now, first of all, it's worse if you don't feel guilty, because guilt has its positive qualities in the sense that you're able to recognize you did something wrong and that there is a struggle in you somewhere for you to do the right thing. So guilt itself isn't inherently bad or isn't inherently wrong either. It's about when we stop just at guilt and we don't take it one step further. So when we take it one step further and we do something constructive with the guilt, then guilt can become good. So you just don't stop at the guilt. All right. Again, in Buddhism, there's nothing that's inherently good and there's nothing that's inherently bad, but it's all about the choices that we make. And there is always a choice for us. It may not necessarily always be the easiest one. It may not always necessarily be the most comfortable one, but there's always a choice in front of us. So instead of guilt, what can we feel? What can we do? And there is a very important word that I want you guys to remember. And it's that we often confuse guilt with remorse or with contrition. And the difference between guilt and remorse is that remorse arises from recognizing a problem and then generating the wish to want to do something about it. All right, so it's guilt 2.0 or guilt escalated, right? Guilt that's been elevated to something else, guilt that's been elevated to be combined with action. So it's not that guilt is inherently bad or that remorse is inherently good, but it's a question of skillfulness. So remorse is a more skillful approach to something because it arises from compassion and it includes a component of mindfulness, because remorse requires you to be mindful of the situation, requires you to be mindful of your complicity in the situation, and it requires you to be mindful of how much the other person is suffering, and then generating the sense and the feeling that I need to do something about this and I need to remedy and to rectify the situation. Remorse recognizes that we've caused harm in somebody else, and it allows us to experience that pain of the other person and then to deepen our commitment in order to not create that same harm or the same level of harm again. All right, so I hurt you because you are no different from me and I don't like being hurt, so I'm sure that you don't like being hurt. And since I would never want to be hurt in this way, I need to do something about myself so that I never carry this same harm or this same experience to other people again in the future. And I wrote here, remorse is about giving ourselves space, and it's about giving ourselves permission to let go and to not repeat the same mistakes again and again. Guilt, on the other hand, is about dwelling in that situation and about dwelling in our involvement in the situation and then just staying there. All right. Remorse is thinking about it, recognizing it, acknowledging it, letting it go, moving on, and then doing something about it. All right. Because when you feel guilty, honestly speaking, what good does it do to anyone? It's just a story that you are telling in your head over and over and over again, and you replay it in your head, and how does it help anyone else? You don't express and you don't engage in anything active to manifest that guilt into something positive, into something constructive, into something that changes the situation ahead of you, right? So how do you practice remorse and not guilt? It's very interesting. I'm in the same building, but the internet on this phone is working, the internet on my other phone is working, but the internet on the computer is not working. We'll talk about obstacles. Anyway, so how do we practice remorse and not guilt. So I've used a few keywords throughout this talk so far, which I'm sure the very, very learned amongst you guys will recognize. The first thing I'm going to say is that in order to practice remorse and not guilt, you must practice the 4 opponent powers, right? So what are the 4 opponent powers? They are the power of regret of a negative activity, the power of refuge, so re-establishing the right attitude to have, and then the power of resolution, so making a decision to not repeat that negative or non-virtuous action again, and then the power of remedy, so applying antidotes, for example, reciting sutras or mantras, or engaging in meditations on emptiness, or engaging in practices of confession, for example, 35 confessional Buddhas, or engaging in practices of purification, for example, the Doju Shukden, Kawang, or Kansha. All right, and personally, why I really like the 4 opponent powers is because it's very, very, I mean, okay, fine. Apart from the fact that it's effective because it was the Buddha who taught it, right? Slight bias on a Buddhist Facebook page. But apart from the fact that it's very effective, I like it because it's very clear. Because when we practice the 4 opponent powers, what we're doing is that it's training us to reestablish or to establish new habits, and to reestablish and establish new approaches to mistakes that we've made. It's very clear. It's step by step. Okay? It gives us a very practical antidote and a practical method that we can apply. And it's not something abstract. It's not saying, go and get a cauldron and put this and that inside, and then ta-da, your situation is magically resolved. It's not that. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, apply it, and you will see a change over time and in the future. You will stop creating the same harm for other people and for yourself in the future. You will stop practicing guilt, and you'll start cultivating remorse instead. So it's very, very clear. I also really like the 4 opponent powers because it trains us to stop focusing on ourselves, and it retrains us to focus on the pain that we've caused and what we can do to, number 1, prevent that situation from happening again, and how we can make amends. And finally, I like it because it helps us to break this cycle, this very unproductive cycle of guilt, because guilt gets us nowhere, and it just compels us to make the same mistakes over and over again, because we don't transform, we don't change, we don't adapt. All right. So first thing about practicing remorse versus guilt is to practice the 4 opponent powers. Next thing is apologizing sincerely and letting it go. And there are a few parts to a sincere apology. So if you guys are familiar with a certain, certain event, certain thing that happened in Malaysia recently, where a person said some very, very hurtful things online to a community of people, and then after a lot of public opinion and a lot of public pressure, was forced to issue a statement. When I read the statement, I thought that, I saw one of the comments that a person had left underneath the statement, and basically they had said that this individual statement was not a sincere apology, and they pointed out, the different parts of a sincere apology, which Rinpoche has also talked to us about before. What are the parts? What makes an apology sincere? So there are a few parts. So the first is an expression of regret. So I'm so sorry. Then the second part is a description of what went wrong. So explaining or recognizing and verbalizing the process that led up to that error. The third thing is acknowledgement of responsibility. So I am responsible for this. I'm so sorry. I'm responsible for this. All right. Then the fourth is a declaration of repentance and accepting any consequences that may come our way. So I'm so sorry. This is what happened that went wrong. I'm responsible for it, and whatever happens as a result of it, I will bear the consequences. Then the fifth is an offer to repair and to demonstrate how we will rectify the situation. And then finally, a request for forgiveness and making an effort not to repeat it again. So all the parts of a sincere apology should sound something like this. I'm so sorry. This is what happened. I'm responsible for it. And whatever happens, I will bear the consequences to it. This is how I propose I will resolve the situation or rectify the situation. And please forgive me. I will put all effort into not repeating it again. All right. So expression of regret, description of what went wrong, acknowledgement of responsibility, declaration of repentance, and acceptance of the consequences, offering to repair and demonstrating how we will repair it, and then requesting forgiveness and making an effort not to repeat it again. All right. So that is how you can practice remorse and not guilt, which is apologizing sincerely and then letting it go. And the part about letting it go is very important, because sometimes when we seek forgiveness, even after we've offered a sincere apology and we seek forgiveness, sometimes people are not always in a position to forgive us, because of whatever experiences they have, because of whatever conclusions they've come to. Sometimes people are just not ready to forgive us, but we've offered up our solution and we've offered up our acknowledgement of our complicity in that situation. So that part about letting it go is just as important as offering a sincere apology. And it's about accepting, if the person chooses to forgive us, it's about accepting the forgiveness that they give us and then letting it go, moving forwards, and then actually doing something about it. Even after having offered that sincere apology, whatever it is that you offer to remedy or offer as your remedy or propose as your remedy, you actually need to implement it, and you actually do need to do the opposite action, right? As it states in the 4 opponent powers. But sometimes, yes, if a person doesn't accept your apology, you just need to move on and accept that your sincerity is enough. And there's a very I'm sure you guys who are familiar with Rinpoche's life story will know, there's a part of Rinpoche's life story that demonstrates and that reflects this. Internet's back on my computer. Yes, Kevin. Hi, Kevin. Yes, your question, the 4 opponent powers, are also mentioned in those teachings. It's the 4 opponent powers, which is, universal to all schools and teachings of Buddhism. All right. So, as I was saying about, apologizing sincerely, there is a story in Rinpoche's biography, which if you guys are familiar with, you will know about how it's important to make a sincere apology and then to let it go. And this took place when Rinpoche had just arrived in Los Angeles, and Rinpoche had joined Thupten Dargyeling Dharma Center in Los Angeles under the guidance of Venerable Geshe Sutrin Gyaltsen. And I will put a link up to the story in the comment section later. But very quickly, Rinpoche had received permission from his first guru in New Jersey to study with Venerable Geshe Sutrin Gyaltsen in Thupten Dargyeling. And after a while staying in Thupten Dargyeling in Los Angeles, Geshe-la had come to learn about Rinpoche's story and the circumstances which had led Rinpoche to leave New Jersey. And Geshe-la said that Rinpoche needs to call up his mother in New Jersey and to apologize for running away. So Rinpoche was 16 or 17 at the time, and like all 17-year-olds, teenagers, Rinpoche was very taken aback and Rinpoche exclaimed and said, "Why do I need to apologize? She's the one who hurt me. She's the one who abused me. She's the one who wanted to stop me from practicing Dharma." So Rinpoche was taken aback that Geshe-la would even suggest that Rinpoche needed to apologize to his mother for running away and for causing hurt to her. And then Geshe-la had a discussion with Rinpoche and basically just told Rinpoche, call her up and apologize to her. And so Rinpoche wasn't the type of person, and never has been the type of person, to disobey his gurus. So Rinpoche picked up the phone and then called his mother in New Jersey. And she answered, and Rinpoche apologized to her. And as Rinpoche had predicted to Geshe-la, after receiving this apology, Rinpoche's mother slammed down the phone, and then she didn't say anything, she just hung up. And she refused to say anything. So, Rinpoche went back to Geshe-la and then reported to Geshe-la what had happened, updated Geshe-la on what had happened, that Rinpoche had followed Geshe-la's instruction to call his mother, and Rinpoche had apologized for running away and for causing hurt to her, and that she had hung up, she hadn't said anything. And all Geshe-la said was, good, because you've apologized to her, you've done what you can do, you've offered your apology sincerely, and now you know that when you do your sadhana every day, the sadhana that you're doing is sincere and genuine, because you have tried to make amends with your mother. So in this story, when we examine this story, what we can see is that Rinpoche did offer the apology sincerely. The forgiveness wasn't given, it wasn't expressed, but in giving this apology, Rinpoche was sincere and then let it go. And so this incident didn't hang over Rinpoche for the rest of his life, because Rinpoche knew that he had tried his best to make amends. All right, so letting go and then moving on. Now, okay, 20 more minutes, almost there. So what else can you do to practice remorse and to not fall into this cycle and this trap of guilt? The other thing you can do is you can examine the source of your guilt and then to reframe your guilt. All right, not refrain, but reframe your guilt. So are you feeling guilty because you haven't done enough? When you feel guilty for not having done enough, then focus on what you have done and what you have accomplished instead, and how far you have come. All right, and do you feel guilty because you maybe want to go further and maybe you want to do more, and you feel guilty for maybe leaving people behind? Or you feel guilty because you don't feel like you deserve to move ahead? In that case, then reframe your guilt, right? So one way you can reframe your guilt, which I read about, was reframing it, seeing it more as fear as opposed to caring. Fear of change, or fear of chasing a dream. Okay, so sometimes we fear change, especially when it's to do with ourselves. Because, as I mentioned earlier, society tells us that when it has to do with ourselves, we need to feel guilty about it. So is it guilt for taking time out for ourselves? Or is it or is it fear for wanting to chase a dream? Is it fear to chase that dream, thinking that things will go wrong? Or is it fear of looking selfish? Right? So how we can deal with guilt and practice remorse instead of cultivating guilt is examining the source of our guilt. Where does the guilt come from? Where does it arise from? And then reframing it into something different, using different language to reframe that guilt. How we can do that is by remembering and by meditating on Buddha's teachings. So, the Buddha taught that all of us are born out of ignorance. And it's not just us that is born out of ignorance. We need to move past that. We also need to think that all beings around us are also born out of ignorance. And all of those beings include our parents, all right, our beloved parents. So when we're born out of ignorance. And then from there, we are taught by imperfect parents. We are taught by our imperfect friends. We are taught by our imperfect media and so on. All right. So definitely we are bound to make mistakes. Of course, we are set up to make mistakes because from birth, we're already taught and we're already given all of these impressions and all of these lessons by everyone else who's also led by ignorance, by everyone else who's also led by selfishness and by self-centeredness. Right, so definitely we are bound to make mistakes, and as a result of that, there's, as I, combining it with what I said earlier, there is no inherently good and there's no inherently bad person. We are just born out of ignorance, and we need to do something about it. And Buddha's teachings teaches us how to do something about that ignorance. And again, that is why we practice the four opponent powers, because it retrains us into committing or into performing actions which are either helpful or not helpful. All right. And when we meditate and we remember Buddha's teachings, it also helps us to remember that and to realize that guilt is actually just very unhelpful baggage, because guilt isn't accompanied by remedial action. Guilt just stops at feeling bad for ourselves, stops at our pity party, and it doesn't move beyond that. It doesn't move to a solution. So what kind of solution can we come up with? How can we create a solution for ourselves? Because the solution is not external. Guilt is all self-driven. Guilt is, all self-created. So if guilt is self-created and we want to practice remorse instead, therefore the solution to practicing remorse as opposed to guilt has to be self-created as well. And how you can do that is you can do that by cultivating compassion for yourselves and for other people, starting by meditating on the fact that all of us are imperfect beings who are all born out of ignorance, and we are bound to make mistakes. Nothing we do will ever be 100% perfect and 100% correct. And in realizing that, it helps us to accept ourselves, and it helps us to accept our mistakes, right? So how do you cultivate compassion for yourself? And the way that you can do that is first by remembering what it is that Rinpoche said, which is that compassion and kindness are our actual natural state of being. So Rinpoche actually said that hating and self-hatred and self-blame are actually unnatural. Why? Because everyone, even the worst person in the world, there is always someone that they like enough to make happy, all right? And that they feel happy when that person is happy. And the example Rinpoche gave, which was actually the world's worst person, if you want to put it that way, Hitler, right? Hitler was awful. He was systematic, and he was evil. He was evil. And everything he did was to the detriment or to the destruction of millions of people, right? But even for somebody as unhelpful and negative as Hitler, as who was so full of anger and hatred as Hitler, he had one person that he felt happy when he made happy, and that was Eva Braun, his partner for like many, many years. He was happy when she was happy. So even for somebody as evil as Hitler, there was one person that made him happy when they were happy. So underneath all that muck, that mud, is our Buddha potential, right? Is compassion and kindness, and that evil and that negativity and that anger and that hatred and all of us manifest it to different degrees. But our natural state is kindness and compassion. So self-hatred, Rinpoche said, it isn't natural, and guilt is actually trained. Probably very famous. Okay, I speak from my experience because Asian family, and you guys will probably know about this if you're familiar with the phenomenon of tiger moms. So very famous, right? Asian families, if you don't get straight A's, you won't get to the best class. And if you don't do well in your exams, you will embarrass me. So we're actually trained from a very, very young age to feel guilty and to feel bad about our mistakes. And it's driven into us thinking that it's fuel for us to become better, when actually it's not. Because when we're not handed the tools from such a young age to do something about the guilt, it just stays at guilt. As a child, we don't necessarily have the cognitive capacity to process that, okay, I feel guilty, therefore I must do something about it, and these are the steps I need to implement. As children, all we hear is the guilt, and if we're not given the tools to deal with the guilt, then it just stays at the guilt, and then that guilt gets imprinted in us, and then we are doomed to repeat it over and over again into our adulthood. So guilt is trained, and on top of guilt being trained, we're also trained out of being compassionate, because we are told that to be compassionate and to be kind is a sign of weakness, and it's not a sign of virtue. And it's self-indulgent. It's self-indulgent to be compassionate, when in actuality, the reality is that it's self-indulgent to be guilty. So then, on the one hand, from a young age, we are told to be guilty about our lack of accomplishments, thinking that it's appropriate fuel for us to become better. And then as we get older, these children who are trained to be guilty and to feel guilty grow up into adults. And then these adults then form the society, which conditions us to think that if we're hard on ourselves, it's a virtue. That if we beat ourselves up, we're going to become stronger people for it. That if we crack the whip on ourselves, it's that we are stronger, that we can tolerate more, that we can tahan more, and that we're better than everyone else if we are hard on ourselves. And that starts from a young age, when people tell us to be hard on ourselves in order to become better people. All right, so how do we practice remorse instead of guilt? You practice remorse instead of guilt because you learn by meditating on Buddha's teachings, and by realizing that all of us are born out of ignorance, we learn to accept that we are imperfect beings, starting from the very beginning, and that as imperfect beings, we will make mistakes, we will stumble, we will fall, we will need to rest. No one can go on forever. And that when we meditate on this, and it becomes easier for us to grasp that we are imperfect beings, we start to undo all this reinforcement that we've received from the very beginning as children. We start to undo that, and we start to accept ourselves and to realize that there's no reason for us to feel guilty about an unintentional error. All right, and that's the key word, which is unintentional, because if we're born out of ignorance and we committed a mistake out of ignorance unintentionally, it becomes easier for us to not feel guilty about that. All right, so why is compassion more appropriate fuel, or better, more powerful fuel? Because guilt is an emotional response. It's not a rational one, and it's not a logical response. And compassion actually is tangible, because from compassion arises, and from compassion you can manifest action, and you can manifest thought, and you can manifest speech that will do something to alleviate the suffering of the other person. And compassion will help to drive you to practice remorse as opposed to guilt, will help to drive you to practice the four opponent powers, that you resolve that you never want to do that again to somebody else, and that you will undertake all measures possible to transform yourself so that you never create that harm for somebody else again. All right. And because of all of that, because of practicing compassion, and because of learning to transform our guilt into remorse instead, and because of us being active in our remedial action, the side effect, the side benefit of doing all of that is that our mind calms down. Because we have less reason to be angry, we have less reason to be frustrated, we have less reason to be depressed, we have less reason to engage in self-harm, to engage in self-blame, to engage in self-hatred. And then we also have less reason to engage in activities or behaviors or coping mechanisms that we need to implement in order to hide or to suppress the guilt that we feel. All right? And also, taking refuge in karma. Taking refuge in karma is very, very powerful, because we understand that the errors and the mistakes that we make, and the imperfections that we manifest, and our poor decision making, all of it is the result of karma, right? And so feeling guilty but not actually doing something about it, that is us rejecting karma. Why? Because when you take refuge in karma, what you're saying is that I can create the karma to not be a poor decision maker in a future life, or to not be a poor decision maker in 5 years, 10 years, 20 years down the line. When you take refuge in karma, you're saying that you have the power and you have the ability to change your behavior, and to change your actions, and to change your habits, so that you can create less harm for yourself and for other people in the future. All right? So, I think the only reason why, hi, good morning, Pastor Tatming. I think the only reason why I've actually made it on time this week is because I spoke so fast. So since I spoke so fast, if I missed out on anything, and if anything is unclear, if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask them. Iman, I see your question here. Pastor Jinai, how about very deep guilt that is irreparable because the person whom we have done something wrong is no longer around, or the person has left us? Any effective method to address such guilt? Thanks. Yes, there is. As I mentioned earlier, the four opponent powers, right? So first of all, when you mentioned such a person that you've done something wrong to, who's no longer with you, you can still apologize, all right? Thanks, Kevin. It's nice to know that I didn't talk too fast this week. But Iman, so apologizing sincerely, that's one thing, right? Whether or not they are around to receive the apology, it's still important to make the apology anyway. And having your apology being sincere and consisting or composing of the parts that I spoke about earlier. And then after having made the apology, letting it go, because you've already made the apology. What can you actually do about it? You can do practices for them, because regret doesn't have to stop just because the person is no longer around, right? So I'll give you an example, personal example, right? Very, very personal example, mostly because I can't think of any example at the moment. 10 years ago, when I first moved back from England, I was actually in a long-term relationship. I was with someone for 4 years, and it was a very committed relationship, the kind that like you're almost at the like next level, ready to get married. I mean, you know, you've been together for 4 years. So I came back to England. I came back from England, and I never actually went back to England. I came back here for a holiday, and then I never went back to England. I moved back here permanently without actually meaning to. And I did it because I was following instructions, you know. But still, in spite of it being an instruction for me to move back here and not to go back to England, I still had a lot of regret for the way that I carried myself and the way I handled that situation. I could have done a much better job with handling that situation, right? But to this day, I have regret for it. I don't talk to that person anymore because I understand and I recognize how deeply I hurt that person. Can you imagine your girlfriend of 4 years goes away on holiday and then just never comes back? I mean, terrible, right? So I have a lot of regret for how I behaved and how I handled the situation. But, after having apologized, the person no longer wants to talk to me, and I understand why they no longer want to talk to me. Do I feel guilty? Yes, I do feel guilty, but it's more regret than guilt. So what do? I can't do anything for them. They've moved on and not talking to me, as I mentioned. But what can I do? I can do prayers for them. They are not Buddhist. They don't necessarily believe in Buddhism, but I believe in Buddhism, and I believe in the power of Buddha's teachings, and I believe in the power of prayers. So what can I do? I pray for them, and then I dedicate merits to them. I make offerings for them. I sponsor things on their behalf, because I can't physically do anything sort of like tangible or directly connected to them anymore. I do what I can, right? So in reply to your question, is there any effective method to address such guilt? Yes, there is. You can still do prayers for the person. You can still make offerings on their behalf and dedicate to them, because you are still doing something for them. It's just like when someone has passed, a pet has passed, for example, they're no longer with us. Can you still do prayers? Can you still do mantras, recite mantras? Can you still sponsor pujas for them? Yes, you can. You can do that, because the mantras and the pujas and prayers will still have effect, even if that physical form is no longer with you. All right, so the 4 opponent powers can be applied when we, even if the person is no longer with us. It may appear to be irreparable in this life, but this life is just this life. It moves on to the next life, all right? So I will also say, take it as a lesson that, and reflect and meditate on the process and the journey that led up to that moment when the hurt was created, or when we created that hurt, and then think, and then through that analysis, think and conclude on ways of how we can not repeat that same action onto other people in the future. Use that experience as a lesson to not repeat that action on others in the future. All right, I hope that was clear and useful. Okay, so Kevin says not too fast, but Jerry says really fast. So last week also I got a very fast, so I will slow down. All right. Do you guys have any more questions? Just let me quickly check. Facebook's really, really weird, right? So Facebook, on the one hand, shows some people's questions, but doesn't show other people. And if you guys are following JP's Mindful Morning Meditation and Paranormal Stories, I think you will be very familiar with this, which is that not everything appears as you think. And we promise we're not ignoring you, we just really don't see the questions. All right, so no more questions for today. I hope that what I shared was clear. If you do have any questions once this live stream ends, please feel free to leave them in the comment section, and I will reply to them either as written reply, or I will answer them in next week's live stream. All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Just want to leave you with this message. In the week that is to come, don't be so hard on yourself, all right? And if you do make mistakes, try to practice a sincere apology consisting of the parts that I talked about, and look at the ways that you can practice the 4 opponent powers for any wrongdoings that may have been committed in the week prior, in last week, all right? Now that we're going into a new week, hopefully with the relaxation of the MCO, you can tell how much I'm looking forward to that. But hopefully with the relaxation of the MCO, now that we're going into a new week, think about how you can apply and practice the 4 opponent powers. Maybe we did do something wrong, we hurt somebody last week or in the week previously. Think about how we can apologize to that person this week and how we can make amends. Like I said at the beginning, it's not always going to be easy. Sometimes it's very, very uncomfortable because you think, oh, okay, apologizing puts me in a position of weakness, or apologizing makes me look bad. But you have to start from somewhere, right? And what's worse, having that person continue to hurt and continue to suffer as a result of our actions, or suffering or experiencing that momentary level of discomfort in apologizing and then offering a remedial action to them. All right. So thank you again so much for joining us. Towards the end, upcoming programs for today, always have to mention that. We have on Tuesday on the Kechara Facebook page, we have Rinpoche Swift Return Puja, which is being led by Pastor Gimli, I believe, in Kechara House in KL. And then Tuesday at 9:30 p.m. Malaysian time, there is the Easy Dharma for New Normal sharing by Pastor David or Pastor Niril. And then today, if you speak Chinese, Pastor Shin will be doing a Dorishukten Sadhana at 2 p.m. on the Chinese Kechara Facebook fan page. And then there will be a live chat with Pastor Albert at 3 p.m. All right. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to ask any of us. We will be happy to answer them. And oh, just to let you guys know, I completely forgot to mention this. And if I don't, Bingkui will have my head. But there is an opportunity to sponsor these teachings, which is available on the Vajra Secrets website. And I'll put a link to that in the description section of this video for you guys. But if you do wish to support the videos and the content that has been produced for the last however many weeks and however many weeks to come, there is an opportunity to sponsor these teachings and these videos via Vajra Secrets. So I'll put a link to that in the description section for you guys. All right. So thank you guys so much for joining me again today. And please don't forget to do your dedications wherever you are, for having taken the time out to listen to my very fast, sometimes not fast sharing. All right. I will see you guys next week, 10 a.m. Malaysian time, GMT +8 on the Kechara Facebook fan page. Thank you guys and have a good week. Bye.